A train, a murder, and a clue sealed in steam. Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host Alexander. Let's grow this sleuthing circle. Comment where in the world you're joining from. You make this mystery come alive, read every note. Let's uncover the crime. It was the sort of afternoon St. Irvins had long come to expect in late May's unwarmed lawns beneath chestnut trees, cucumber sandwiches curling ever so slightly at the edges, and a light string quartet murmuring beneath a canvas tent near the vicariage's rose border. The vicar, the Reverend Hesketh, bustled with grave enthusiasm from guest to guest, pausing only now and then to remove a ladybird from his cassock or refill the elderflower punch. It was the village's first proper gathering since the Queen's Jubilee the year before, and it promised little more than the usual gossip, sunburn, and perhaps a minor wasp sting. But then there was the flyer. It fluttered down like a torn petal, dislodged from some unseen hand, or perhaps blown by a sudden puff of breeze. It landed on the cake table, precisely between a slightly lopsided Victoria sponge and a bowl of strawberries and cream. No one noticed it at first, no one except Miss Marple. She had been seated nearby under the dappled shade of a pear tree, her eyes half-lidded but alert. Her knitting needles were momentarily idle in her lap. It wasn't the paper itself that drew her attention, it was the way that Miss Cora Brinton, the postmistress, had flinched when she saw it. A few moments later, young Alfie Penrose, age 12 and recently returned from school in Oxfordshire, picked it up with a theatrical flourish. "Something from the railway, I think," he declared, waving it like a proclamation. A train notice, but how odd guests leaned in, drawn by the only unscheduled excitement of the afternoon. Alfie read aloud, "The 437 to Paddington will be delayed due to unforeseen circumstances. Kindly note death never runs late." A rustle of confusion moved through the assembled guests. Mrs. Emmeline Crouch, ever inclined to dramatics, gave a high-pitched laugh. A joke, surely, some sort of prank, but it wasn't funny, not really. Not when poor Major Talbot, retired and rather too fond of port, collapsed not half an hour later on the same patch of lawn, his face purpling and a smear of trifle about his lips. The vicar called for Dr. Lavington was summoned, but even before he arrived, the truth settled into the soft folds of the garden like a breath of chill wind. Major Talbot was dead. Later, when the police came, someone remembered the flyer. It was passed from gloved hand to gloved hand with furrowed brows and muttered questions. No one claimed to have written it. No one knew where it had come from. Miss Marple, still seated by the pear tree, resumed her knitting. Her needles clicked softly. She had known Harold Talbot before the war, of course, an unpredictable man with a nasty temper and a habit of remembering debts when it suited him. And she remembered something else too, the way Miss Brinton had looked, away from the flyer as if it might burn. "It begins," Miss Marple murmured quietly to no one in particular, tightening a loop of yarn, and in a very English fashion. The news, as it always does in villages like St. Irvins, travelled with astonishing swiftness and an undeniable flair for embellishment. By dusk, the story of Major Talbot's death had taken on several forms, each more lurid than the last. Some swore he had gasped out a name before collapsing, others that a mysterious woman in navy blue had fled the scene just before the Major fell face forward into his plate of gooseberry tart. In truth, none of this happened. The Major had slumped quietly and inelegantly to the ground with a wheeze, twitching once or twice before going entirely still. There had been a small cluster of onlookers, Miss Crouch, the Penroses, Miss Brinton, and the Reverend Hesketh's rather severe-looking sister, Beatrice Anone, none of whom had seen anything of note. Or so they claimed. By the following morning, the death had become the subject of a dozen whispered conversations behind drawn curtains and through shop counters. The police from much dithering had visited in the night, having been summoned with undue haste by Dr. Lavington, who had declared himself concerned. but uncertain. A post-mortem had been arranged. Suspicion was politely and inconclusively floated, but it was the flyer that truly captivated the village imagination. "Death never runs late. I don't like it," muttered Mr. Reeves, the village grocer, polishing his scales with an old rag as he spoke to Mrs. Webb, the widow who lived above the hairdressers. "It's not natural, things like that being printed and left lying about." Mrs. Webb, who had never liked Major Talbot and didn't mind saying so now he was gone, lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Poison, I heard, or something slipped in the cream. They say he went quite blue, and the flyer." Mr. Reeves persisted. "Someone planned it. Mark my words, someone who knew." At the post office, Miss Brinton seemed unnaturally flustered, misplacing letters and snapping at her assistant, young Deirdre Fenn. Her usual meticulous cheer had given way to a nervous stiffness. Twice she dropped her spectacles when Miss Marple came in to collect her parcel. A new ball of merino wool and a small book of essays. Miss Brinton barely met her eyes. "Terrible business yesterday," Miss Marple said gently, as she counted out her coins. "I always thought Major Talbot looked the sort to suddenly keel over. Poor heart, one assumes." Miss Brinton cleared her throat and fiddled with a stack of envelopes. "Yes, dreadful shock. I didn't see anything, really, not until it was, well, too late." Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly. "But you were there, weren't you? By the cake table. I do remember the yellow rose pinned to your cardigan." Miss Brinton's lips parted, and for a second something passed over her expression, surprise, perhaps, or dismay, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Oh, yes, I was helping Mrs. Crouch serve, just before the incident. Then I went to speak with Beatrice Hesketh. I hardly saw a thing." "I'm afraid it's all a blur." Miss Marple didn't press further. She tucked her package neatly into her handbag and smiled her gentle, grandmotherly smile. "Well, I dare say the police will sort it out, though I always think that what people don't say is often more revealing than what they do." She left Miss Brinton blinking behind the counter, clutching a wad of unsorted flyers in her trembling hands. Across the village, others took up the tale with gusto. At the butcher's, Sergeant Blake Young, earnest and not particularly imaginative, was overheard telling the butcher's boy that he was almost certain it had been a simple cardiac arrest. "But you've got to consider the context," he added gravely. "The flyer's odd, might be a prank, or maybe not." In the tea room, Mrs. Crouch presided over a fresh pot of Darjeeling like a queen at her court, her voice tremulous with dramatic flair. She had seen the whole thing, she said. Every dreadful moment. She was just reaching for the sponge cake. When Major Talbot had let out a grunt like a pig being slaughtered and collapsed beside her wicker chair, she claimed, screamed. There was no record of this. Very high color, he had, she declared to anyone who would listen. Flushed like a boiled beetroot, and sweating like anything, quite dreadful. But I just knew, something wasn't right. I said to myself, Emmeline, something wicked this way comes. And look what happened. Not far from the tea room, Dr. Lavington was pacing in his consulting room, muttering over his initial notes and nursing a mild headache. He'd known Harold Talbot a long while, treating him occasionally for blood pressure, gout, and the occasional bout of sleeplessness. Nothing, however, that would have suggested sudden death, or poison, or flyers foretelling doom. At the vicarage, Reverend Hesketh and his sister were less interested in gossip than in decency. The vicar had spent the better part of the morning writing a tasteful but firm letter to the St. Irvan Parish Gazette, urging calm and praying for temperance in speculation. Beatrice, meanwhile, was convinced that the entire incident was the result of continental influences, though she refused to elaborate. And what of Miss Marple? She spent the afternoon quietly pruning her rose bushes and observing the small movements of Village life with a practised eye, a dropped handkerchief, a hesitation in a goodbye, a young man walking too fast past the war memorial. These were the things she noticed, things no one else thought to see at tea. She reread the flyer, which she had been permitted to borrow for the evening by a sheepish Sergeant Blake. The 437 to Paddington will be delayed due to unforeseen circumstances. Kindly note death never runs late. A strange sort of message. It sounded theatrical, but not humorous. There was something deliberate in its phrasing, something rehearsed. Miss Marple had seen dozens of notices from the railway in her day. This had all the structure of the real thing but none of the substance. Who had made it? And why leave it there? And what was it about Miss Brinton's reaction that so disturbed her? By evening, as twilight settled over St. Irvan and the faint call of an owl echoed from the churchyard, the village sat restless in its uncertainty. No one knew what had truly happened to Major Talbot, but everyone had a theory. Few could agree on the facts, and even fewer were prepared to admit how little they truly knew about the man now lying in the cold cell at the coroner's office in much dithering. Miss Marple sat in her armchair by the fire, her knitting in her lap and the flyer beside her cup of chamomile tea. People so often think the worst when the truth, she mused silently, is simply hidden in plain sight, tucked beneath manners and sponge cake and the reassuring rhythms of village life. Tomorrow she will begin her quiet inquiries, and someone, somewhere in St. Irvan, would begin to worry. Morning arrived in St. Irvan with a soft mist curling low along the hedgerows and the promise of a warm, if overcast, day. The village stirred slowly. Doors creaked open, kettles boiled, and dogs were walked down narrow lanes under hedges that still held the scent of last night's rain. But a new mood had taken hold, something taut and uneasy, like a string pulled too tight. At 9:15 sharp, Inspector Graves arrived from much dithering. He was a tall man with thin shoulders and greying temples, and he walked with the stiffness of someone who had grown tired of asking the same questions too. People determined not to answer them. Graves was not unfamiliar with St. Irvan, had investigated a stolen bicycle here once, and a rather dubious case of tampered marmalade, but a sudden death at a public event was quite another matter. Sergeant Blake, already waiting at the vicarage, with a notebook to clean for real police work, briefed the inspector with the sincerity of a loyal but unimaginative subordinate. Miss Marple, who happened to be delivering some quince jelly to Reverend Hesketh that morning gently by coincidence. Of course, he was ushered into the drawing room for a short visit, just as Inspector Graves and the Reverend began their conversation. In the adjacent study, she did not eavesdrop, strictly speaking, but she did notice voices carry very well in the old vicarage, particularly through the narrow archway beside the fireplace, where sound travelled as if along a funnel. So, let me be clear. Reverend Inspector Graves was saying, his voice clipped. You noticed nothing unusual about Major Talbot before his collapse, the Reverend sighed. Nothing that struck me as alarming. He was perhaps a touch flushed, though I assumed it was the port. He'd helped himself to a glass just before tea, and this flyer most distressing, Hesketh interrupted, an ill-conceived joke. If it was one at all, my sister believes it was meant to frighten. She says it's theatrical. Miss Marple, seated neatly with her cup of tea and her gift of quince jelly politely received and now forgotten on the sideboard, stirred her spoon once and set it down. Yes, it has the flavour of stagecraft, she murmured more to herself than anyone else, a great deal of effort to be ominous, without being specific. In the study, Inspector Graves continued, were any strangers in attendance, anyone from outside the village? The Reverend paused. Not that I know of. St. Irvan is not the sort of place that draws tourists in May. Miss Marple rose with a quiet apology and made her way out through the garden door. She had heard enough to understand what the police did, not they were beginning. With facts and logistics, who had been there, who had seen what, and yet, she thought, they were already one step behind. The truth did not lie in events, it lay in people. That afternoon, she took a slow and deliberate walk down to the green. Along the way she stopped to admire Mr. Pendle's dahlias, which were already threatening to overtake the fence, and to inquire after Mrs. Martinale's cat, who had gone, missing again, but her true destination was the small village tea room, where she knew Mrs. Crouch would be holding court and where Miss Brinton, inevitably, would be on her way to fetch her usual cream bun and letter from the parish council. As expected, the tea room was abuzz. Miss Deirdre Fenn from the post office was sitting stiffly at the corner table, pretending not to overhear. The Penrose twins, university-bound and full of ideas, sat near the window. Dissecting the incident in hushed, gleeful tones, Mrs. Crouch, proud in a large brooch shaped like a peacock, was speaking louder than necessary to a wide-eyed Mrs. Webb. "I tell you," she said, "the poor man was cursed. All that business with the land, remember, the argument with the Lavingtons over that hedge he tore up, and the thing with the widow from Dumbrigeo, what was her name? Margaret something. Run off abroad in the end." Miss Marple took her seat, and waited, as she often did, without speaking. When silence eventually noticed her presence, it became awkward. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Crouch said at last, "how very calm you are, considering all that's happened. I've always found that rushing to judgment rarely improves clarity," Miss Marple replied, folding her napkin, "and besides, it is not the first time I've seen a man fall dead after dessert. The key is not in the death, you know, it is in what came before." "You mean the flyer?" Miss Marple looked at her, smiling. "No. I mean what led someone to write it." Mrs. Crouch blinked. "You think it wasn't a prank? I think it was meant to be seen, and that tells me a great deal about whoever left it." As the conversation shifted again to speculation about poisons and railway paper stock, Miss Marple turned to Miss Deirdre Fenn, who had been silent but not unlistening. "Deirdre," she said gently, "you've worked under Miss Brinton for years, haven't you?" The girl flushed. "Yes, Miss Marple, since I left school. She must trust you a great deal." Deirdre hesitated. "I suppose. Then I imagine you would know if she had been under any unusual stress lately. Perhaps an argument, a disagreement with someone who came in." Deirdre's face turned a deeper shade of pink. "Miss Brinton is very proper, miss. She doesn't like trouble. But there was someone, last week. A man came in, asked for her specifically. They argued, quietly. But it was serious. Afterwards, she locked the office and cried for 20 minutes. I wasn't supposed to know. Did you recognize him? No. Tall, wore a hat, like he didn't want to be noticed. Had a leather case, like a solicitor." Miss Marple placed her hands neatly in her lap and nodded. "Thank you. My dear, you've been very helpful." Outside, the clouds had grown heavier, casting a grey hush over the village. Miss Marple stepped into the cool air with her mind full of quiet thoughts. A solicitor, perhaps. Or someone pretending to be. What did Miss Brinton have to hide? She made her way to the high street and stood briefly at the war memorial. The names carved in stone were familiar, etched in the hearts of the village. Major Talbot's older brother was among them, killed in action, 1917. Harold had inherited the house, the land, and the obligations that came with them. But he had never inherited the respect his brother had earned. It was no secret he'd been difficult, some said cruel, others simply proud. Miss Marple remembered an incident from a fête several years prior when he had publicly chastised a young couple for parking their bicycle too close to the war graves. It had been unnecessary and unkind. By the time she returned to her cottage, evening was falling again, and her roses needed watering. She moved slowly among the blooms, clippers in one hand, thoughts in the other. She was beginning to see the edges of a pattern, not the whole tapestry in it yet, but the thread was there. Thin and red, running quietly beneath the polite surface. Of village life. Tomorrow she will visit Dr. Lavington, not to ask about poisons, that would be too forward. But perhaps there had been something in the Major's final days, a change in his habits, a new prescription, an uncharacteristic visit. The flyer had been a signal, yes, but not merely a warning. It had been a performance, set upon a stage where everyone knew their role and someone had played theirs to perfection. By the third day after Major Talbot's death, the rhythm of St. Irvan had not resumed its usual pace. Though the post still arrived, the shop still opened, and the milkman made his rounds with punctual solemnity. Everything carried the faint whiff of disruption. Windows opened more cautiously, conversations turned quiet when footsteps approached. It was as though the village itself was holding its breath. The news from Much Dithering came mid-morning. The post-mortem results were inconclusive. Pending further toxicological tests, Dr. Lavington, who had assisted the pathologist, had passed along this summary to the police in a tone laced with careful vagueness. Inspector Graves, always a man who preferred clear outcomes, had not been pleased. Still, it was enough for the village grapevine to pounce upon. Poison, said Mrs. Webb, folding her arms in the bakery queue. Always said it was, that man had enemies. Not just old disputes real, festering ones. Rat poison, probably, guessed young Alfie Penrose, earning a withering look from the baker's wife. Or something in the port. Someone said he brought his own bottle. That's nonsense, interrupted Mrs. Crouch from behind a lace-trimmed parasol. I poured him a glass myself from the decanter on the side table. It was perfectly ordinary. Sherry. I think port, said Mr. Reeves, who had been passing with a crate of tinned pears. And a very good one. He bragged about it to the grocer in Much Dithering last week. Bought 2 bottles for his birthday. Said he didn't trust anyone else's. Palate, Miss Marple, observing all this from a bench near the green, nodded once. That matched what she had heard earlier. Major Talbot had brought his own port, but it had been decanted for serving. That raised an intriguing possibility. If the poison had been in the drink, then it must have been introduced either just before the gathering or by someone with access to the vicarage beforehand. She decided it was time to speak with Dr. Lavington. The doctor lived in a red-bricked cottage at the edge of the village. Its modest garden neatly clipped, its hedge always suspiciously symmetrical. He had the air of a man who measured things for peace of mind, calories, footsteps, conversations. He received Miss Marple politely, though a trace of tension crept into his shoulders as she sat in the high-back chair opposite his writing desk. I won't pretend I'm not surprised to see you, he said after a moment, but I suppose you're not here about your own health. No, doctor, Miss Marple replied pleasantly, adjusting her handbag. Although I am always glad to benefit from your expertise, I was simply wondering whether Major Talbot had visited you recently. He looked rather tired, I thought, just before his unfortunate episode. Dr. Lavington leaned back slightly. He came in the week before last, complained of dizziness and heart palpitations, but refused to consider cutting back on drink. I advised him to take things easy. I doubt he listened. No new prescriptions, nothing he hadn't had before. A mild sedative, but he was erratic. The truth is, Miss Marple, he was a difficult man to treat. He didn't trust doctors, or anyone, really. She nodded, eyes downcast for a moment. I suppose that's why he quarrelled with so many. There were whispers, you know, about him threatening to cut off the old gardener's pension, and that business. With the Lavingtons, which business? He asked, too quickly. Oh, I'm not sure, Miss Marple said, voice light. Something about a hedge or a fence. I'm afraid my memory isn't what it once was. Dr. Lavington exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening over his pen. He accused me of overcharging him for a house call last Christmas, told everyone I charged for 3 visits when I'd only made 2. I didn't, but it embarrassed my wife terribly. Said he'd report me to the medical board. Did he? No, but he liked holding things over people. The Major enjoyed power, and he used it in petty ways that makes enemies, Miss Marple. If you're looking for suspects, I imagine you'll find half the village could cheerfully have done him in, except, Miss Marple replied gently, that most people who despise a man are content to wait for time to handle matters. It takes something more personal to make someone take fate into their own hands. The doctor said nothing. Miss Marple rose and thanked him for the tea he hadn't offered. Later that day, word spread that Inspector Graves had begun interviewing individuals more directly. One of the first to be spoken to was Miss Brinton. She had, after all, been near the scene and was remembered to have turned pale when the flyer had been discovered by early evening. A more focused rumour had taken root that Miss Brinton was under suspicion. I said it from the beginning, Mrs. Crouch told Reverend Hesketh's housekeeper. She looked guilty as sin, and so secretive these past months, coming in late, locking the post office back room, pretending not to recognise her own handwriting on that flyer. She didn't write it, the housekeeper replied with unusual firmness. I've seen her letters, neat, small loops. The flyer was all capital letters and typeface. That point was repeated later in the pub, and again at the tea room, and finally, during the church bell ringer's Thursday practice. Still, the stain of suspicion lingered. Miss Marple, meanwhile, paid a quiet visit to the Penrose twins. Their father, Mr. Jonathan Penrose, had been a friend of Major Talbot's in the way that only to men who had once fought over the same piece of land could be friends cordial at garden shows. Brittle at council meetings, father didn't like him much, admitted Harriet Penrose as she served Miss Marple a cup of nettle tea, but he said Talbot was useful, influential on the parish council, though he did say something odd last week. Oh, he said, I hope that man gets what's coming to him, but I'd rather it wasn't my business to deliver it. Interesting turn of phrase, Miss Marple murmured. And did your father attend the party? Only briefly, left before tea. I had to go to a meeting in Dithering, alibi established if true, but it was something else that caught Miss Marple's interest. On the mantelpiece sat a narrow black case, leather, the kind a solicitor or clerk might carry. It matched Deirdre Fenn's description perfectly. Your father's briefcase, she asked, nodding toward it. Harriet looked over. Oh, no, that's not his. It belongs to Mr. Linley. He left it here last Friday when they were working on that lease dispute. Mr. Linley, solicitor from Dunbridge, friend of father's. Comes by sometimes to help with documents. Miss Marple's mind ticked quietly. Later that evening, she sat by her window as the street lamps flickered on one by one. She watched shadows stretch across the cobbles and listened to the church bell chime 7. The village had settled on Miss Brinton as the prime suspect, but Miss Marple had her doubts. The woman was secretive, yes, frightened, perhaps. But she lacked the cruelty required to compose such a calculated message as that flyer, and her fear had not been of guilt, it had been the fear of someone with something to lose. The solicitor from Dunbridge, on the other hand, now had a name worth remembering. One by one, pieces of the pattern were sliding into place, and still. It was not the grand moments that revealed the truth, but the quiet ones, the dropped word, the borrowed case, the way a name was spoken or not spoken at all. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided she would make a visit to Dunbridge. There were still questions that needed answering, and someone, somewhere, was hoping they wouldn't be asked. The next morning, the mist rolled back from the fields with a reluctant sigh, revealing a pale blue sky streaked with wisps of high cloud. Birds chirped with brisk purpose, and the roses in Miss Marple's front garden leaned into the sun, oblivious to murder and mischief. But Miss Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human behaviour, had no intention of wasting the day on idle pruning or the Sunday crossword. By 9:30, she was on the early bus to Dunbridge, a small town some 8 miles east. Respectable in appearance, but filleted as all towns are with its own share of intrigues. Miss Marple carried no bag larger than her usual woven handbag, and her outfit blue coat, sensible shoes, straw hat with a navy ribbon marked her as a woman entirely unremarkable. The kind who would be asked to mind a stranger's suitcase without hesitation, and that, of course, was exactly how she preferred it. Her first stop in Dunbridge was the post office, ostensibly to send a letter, though it had already been addressed and sealed. Her real purpose was to ask, with a hint of frailty in her voice, whether there was a solicitor nearby who might assist her with a very small and tedious matter regarding an old lease agreement. "Oh yes," said the young woman behind the counter. "Mr. Linley on Beechwood Lane. Been there for years." A short walk later found Miss Marple standing before a neat terraced building with a brass plaque that read Arthur Linley and Co. Solicitors, Estate 1903. The office door creaked faintly as she opened it, and the scent of old carpet, polish, and slightly damp paper greeted her, the receptionist. A woman of no more than 25 with a tight bun and an air of bored efficiency looked up from her ledger. "I'm terribly sorry to drop in unannounced," Miss Marple said kindly, "but I believe Mr. Linley may have helped a friend of mine recently, Penrose of St. Irvan, and I wondered if I might trouble him for a moment about a lease matter of my own. Do you have an appointment?" "No, dear, but I shan't take but a moment of his time." With some reluctance, the young woman disappeared into the back. A moment later, Arthur Linley emerged, a man in his early 40s, with sandy hair going grey at the temples, a smart but tired suit, and eyes that took in more than they revealed. "Miss Marple, is it?" he said politely, though his brow showed the faintest flicker of unease. "Do come in." His office was lined with neat rows of legal books and 2 sets of leather chairs flanking a battered walnut desk. A teacup sat to the side, half-drink, the spoon left at an awkward angle. "I gather you've come from St. Irvan. Indeed, such a charming village, though perhaps a little too eventful these days." His face remained neutral. "Yes, I heard something about the Major. Very unfortunate." "You knew Major Talbot only by reputation." Mr. Penrose mentioned him once or twice in passing. "A great many people seem to have known him only by reputation," Miss Marple said, gently amused. "But reputations often leave behind facts more interesting than truth." Linley gave a thin smile but said nothing. "I'm sure it's just a coincidence," Miss Marple continued pleasantly. "But you left a briefcase behind at the Penroses recently, did you not?" Now his composure slipped, only for a second. His mouth tightened. "Yes, I left in a rush. Meant to retrieve it sooner, but Mr. Penrose said it could wait." "Oh, naturally. It's just that one of the young ladies described the case to metal, black, with a leather handle, matches what a certain visitor to our post office was carrying a few days ago." His gaze grew cold. "Are you suggesting I was in the post office?" "I suggest nothing at all," Miss Marple said gently. "I only recall what young Deirdre Fenn observed someone tall, wearing a hat, and carrying such a case. He argued quietly with Miss Brinton and left in a hurry. And of course that same day she appeared altered." Mr. Linley stood, walked to the window, and folded his arms. "I did speak with her," he admitted, "privately, on a legal matter." "What sort of matter?" "I can't tell you that." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Then let us say instead that I am an old woman with more curiosity than wisdom, and I hope you'll forgive me for prying." He looked back at her, hesitated, and then sat again. She came to me 3 weeks ago, Miss Brinton, wanted legal advice on a personal issue strictly off the record. She'd recently come into possession of a set of letters, old ones, from Major Talbot, letters from his time in Burma. They contained ugly things, racist remarks, abusive orders, suggestions of misconduct during his service, apparently. He'd written to another officer and used language that would be ruinous today. Miss Brinton found these. They were in a bundle of estate papers sent through the post office. She opened them by mistake, confused the labels. Once she realized what she had, she felt she couldn't ignore them. She feared what would happen if they became public, so she came to you. She wanted to know whether she had the right to disclose them. I advised discretion, but Talbot got wind of it somehow. He confronted revealed threats, mostly, said he'd ruin her. That's when she panicked. She told me he'd even tried to suggest she'd tampered with village mail before. And did she still have the letters? Linley nodded. She gave them to me for safekeeping. I still have them. Miss Marple paused for a moment. And may I ask, did she write that flyer? Linley looked at her sharply. Absolutely not. That sort of drama would have terrified her. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. It doesn't sound like her at all. She rose and thanked him, gently declining his offer of a cab to the bus station. Outside, the sun had brightened, and a breeze lifted the edge of her coat as she walked toward the square. She passed the printers on the corner, Fairfax and Sons, general printing and announcements. Something in the window made her stop. Among the displayed samples was a railway notice, familiar font, the same trim border. Inside, the shopkeeper greeted her cheerfully. Looking for flyers, miss? Oh no, she said, stepping closer to inspect the typeface. Just admiring. So many styles. Tell me, do you do private commissions? Indeed, we do wedding invitations, event flyers, even theatrical posters. Ohms, too. Ohms, yes. Sometimes for local plays or charity events, someone just the other. Week brought in a design to mimic a real railway notice, said it was for a murder mystery evening. Very clever. Actually, Miss Marple smiled warmly. And would you remember who placed that order? The man frowned. I believe he gave his name as Mr. Penrose, said it was a surprise game for a village party, paid in cash. Nice fellow. Mr. Penrose, she echoed. Yes, tall gentleman, bit of grey at the temples. Lawyerish, if you ask me. She thanked him, took a complimentary leaflet, and stepped back into the sun. Mr. Penrose, not the twins. Not their solicitor friend, but the man himself. The flyer had not been a prank, it had been a message, but for whom? Miss Marple boarded the return bus to St. Irvan with the quiet satisfaction of a piece clicking into place. She now had a direction. What she still lacked was a motive sharp enough to kill. That, she thought, would come with careful listening. And tomorrow she would begin her next visit with the one person no one seemed to be speaking to, Beatrice. Hesketh, the Reverend's sister, had been at the garden party, as still and unspeaking as a statue, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that statues, like silence, often hide the loudest truths. The vicarage always had the air of sanctified calm, but on this particular morning, a tautness hung in its corridors like mist on the village green, subtle yet unmistakable. Reverend Hesketh greeted Miss Marple with his usual warm formality, though there was a note of nervousness in his welcome, as if he suspected she might be carrying more than her handbag and soft smile. Do come in, Miss Marple, he said, leading her through the small hallway, where old parish newsletters were pinned to a corkboard beneath a faded photograph of the Queen's last visit to the county. Beatrice is in the parlour, sorting the altar cloths. She'll be pleased with the company, I'm sure. Miss Marple followed, her pace steady, her thoughts sharper than her gait suggested. Beatrice Hesketh sat at the far end of the room, beside a basket of freshly ironed linens, her hands moving in small, practised motions. She looked up as Miss Marple entered. And her expression did not flicker. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said. "I'm told you've been asking questions." Miss Marple smiled and took a seat near the fireplace. Only the sort of questions one asks when things don't quite sit right. It's not nosiness, you know, it's observation. "People do speak volumes when they're silent," Beatrice continued, folding. "Then you must find my company quite deafening." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You were at the party. You saw the flyer. You saw Major Talbot collapse." "I did." Beatrice laid a folded cloth into the basket. "And I've said as much to the inspector. But you didn't mention that you spoke to Miss Brinton just before the incident." That earned a pause. Beatrice's fingers slowed for a breath, then resumed. "She came to me in confidence. She was distressed about the letters." Beatrice glanced up, but her voice remained calm. "She didn't tell me what they contained, only that she feared Major Talbot might try to discredit her. She asked me if I believed people could change. I told her no, that's a hard view. It is a realistic one," Beatrice replied. "Men like Harold Talbot do not change. They mellow, perhaps, but only in the eyes of those who benefit from their favour. Miss Brinton had no such protection. And you," Beatrice's eyes held a quiet steel, "Harold Talbot was not a man I admired, nor trusted, nor mourn." It was the closest thing to confession Miss Marple expected to hear, but not guilt, no. This was not the voice of a murderer. It was the voice of a woman who had endured something, long ago perhaps, and lived on despite it. Miss Marple left the vicarage not with answers, but with a subtle shift in her understanding of the landscape. Back on the high street, the windows of the post office gleamed in the afternoon light. Inside, Miss Brinton was arranging a tray of returned mail when Miss Marple entered. Her smile was tight, but her eyes held fatigue rather than fear. "You'll have seen Mr. Linley, I expect," she said before Miss Marple could speak. "I did." "Then I won't insult you by pretending I'm surprised." Miss Marple stepped forward gently. "The letters are safe. You did nothing wrong in passing them along." Miss Brinton's laugh was brittle. "Did I not? I opened a post not meant for me. I read things I shouldn't have. I involved a solicitor behind the council's back, and now people look at me as though I poisoned that man. But you didn't." Miss Brinton's composure cracked, her eyes filled with tears. "No." "But I hated him," she whispered, "for what he'd done, not to me, to someone else." She walked to the small door behind the counter and opened a drawer. From it, she withdrew a photograph sepia-toned and curled at the edges. She handed it to Miss Marple. "My brother," she said, "Wilfred, he served under Talbot in Burma, came back half a man, never spoke of it until he died. Those letters were the first clue I had vile language. References to punishments, threats disguised as orders." Miss Marple studied the face in the photograph, a boy with tired eyes and a stiff collar, not unlike the others whose names sat carved in stone near the war memorial. "I don't want justice, Miss Marple," she continued. "I want the truth to matter, but not at the cost of suspicion and scandal, and certainly not murder." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet someone chose both." She left the post office deep in thought, retracing her steps toward the green. Along the way, she passed young Deirdre Fenn speaking with Alfie Penrose outside the grocer's. Their tones were hushed, almost conspiratorial. When they noticed her, their conversation halted. Something between them had changed since the garden party. That evening, Miss Marple invited the Penrose twins for tea. They arrived promptly, polite and well-mannered as ever, but it was clear the air of ease had gone. Harriet spoke more than usual. Michael said little and avoided her eyes midway through. Tea, Miss Marple offered them a small distraction. I do hope your father found his briefcase. Harriet nodded. Yes, Mr. Linley collected it yesterday. And the mystery of the flyer. Has he mentioned it again? The twins exchanged a glance. I think father said he might have seen something, Michael said hesitantly. But he hasn't told the police. Oh. Miss Marple's voice was calm. That's curious. He said it was nothing. Just that he'd noticed someone near the refreshment table before the collapse. Someone he hadn't expected to see there. Who? Michael hesitated. Harriet placed her cup down, a little too hard. It was Deirdre. She said, the post office girl. Miss Marple blinked. But she said she left early. She did, said Michael slowly. But then she came back. I saw her behind the tent, near the roses. She looked upset. She had an argument with Alfie earlier that day. Harriet added, it was about the flyer, she accused him of making it. Said she recognized the typeface. Miss Marple set her cup down with great care. Did she now? The twins looked uncomfortable. She said he had it printed as a joke. Something to startle people. She begged him not to use it. And did he? Michael glanced down. We don't know. But Alfie's been odd. Keeps asking questions he already knows the answers to. After they left, Miss Marple sat in her chair by the fire, unmoving. The shadows danced quietly on the wall, and the mantel clock ticked in patient rhythm. It was beginning to coalesce. The flyer had been created deliberately. It had been delivered to a specific place and time, and now there were signs that two young people knew more than they should, and that fear, or perhaps guilt, had settled heavily on both. And what of Mr. Penrose? He had connections, a motive, perhaps certainly proximity. But Miss Marple had seen men like him before. They played chess with power, not poison. The subtleties of village life were not their battlefield, no. This was a more personal act. Someone had felt cornered, humiliated, or maybe protective of another. Tomorrow, she will speak to Deirdre directly, and soon, very soon, someone's carefully folded secret would come undone. The air on Saturday morning had a peculiar edge too. A kind of electricity that hadn't been present in the gentle spring days that preceded it. A strong wind had swept in overnight, rattling window panes and scattering petals from the vicariage's roses across the village green. It was as though the peaceful veil over St. Irvan had been lifted, and something raw and unresolved was stirring. Just beneath the surface, Miss Marple rose early, her routine unchanged. Breakfast was a boiled egg, one slice of toast with marmalade, and 2 cups of tea, but unlike most mornings, her second cup went untouched. She sat at her kitchen table, turning a single sheet of folded paper over in her hands, a note that had slipped through her letterbox sometime during the night. The handwriting was small and hasty. Please come, it's about Alfie. I don't know what to do. No address, no time. But Miss Marple had little doubt who had written it. Deirdre Fenn's neat but nervous script matched the birthday card she'd once delivered to the church secretary, and the content, of course, was unmistakable by 10 o'clock. Miss Marple was knocking on the side door of the Fenn's modest cottage near the edge of the common. Deirdre answered at once, pale and wringing her hands in a dish towel. Her usual tidy hair was loose at the temples, and she looked as though she hadn't slept. Thank you for coming, she said in a rush, stepping aside. Miss Marple entered quietly and took a seat in the sitting room, which smelled faintly of lavender and boiled potatoes. Deirdre perched on the edge of the opposite chair, her hands twisting in her lap. I didn't know who else to tell, she began, barely above a whisper. It's just everything's gone wrong, and I can't stop thinking I should have said something sooner. Miss Marple nodded, encouraging her with nothing more than a soft look. It's about the flyer, Deirdre said. Alfie did have it printed. That part's true. I told him not to. He said it was just a joke, a prank to liven up the party, a joke with such an ominous message. Miss Marple asked gently. Deirdre flushed. It was meant to be a mock murder mystery, one of those solve-the-crime games people play at parties. He wanted to leave it on the cake table, let people talk. Maybe plan a second flyer to reveal the victim later. He swore it was harmless, but the major actually died. Yes, and now he's terrified. Says he didn't poison anyone. But her voice cracked. Miss Marple, I don't think it was just a coincidence. I think someone used Alfie's prank as cover. Miss Marple reached over and placed her hand on the girl's. You're very brave to say so. Deirdre swallowed hard. He's been different since it happened. Jumpy. Keeps asking if anyone saw him near the drinks table. He told me he didn't go near it, but then Michael Penrose said he saw him behind the tent just before the major collapsed. Alfie denied it, but he had something in his coat pocket, a bottle. I think. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Did you ask him what it was? He said it was nothing. Just something for the joke, he said, but I don't believe him. Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence for several seconds. Then she said, Deirdre, I believe you've told me the truth. And that truth may very well save more trouble than. Do you think Alfie did it? Miss Marple's answer was measured. I think Alfie set a stage he didn't understand, and someone else may have stepped in with their own script. She stood, smoothing the front of her coat. One more question. If you don't mind, she said as she reached the door. Has anyone else been here recently? Asked questions. Anyone unexpected? Deirdre hesitated, then nodded. Mr. Penrose, the father, he came yesterday. Asked if Alfie had talked to me. Said he was worried about him, but there was something strange about it. Strange? He wasn't concerned like a neighbour, more like a lawyer looking for a statement. Miss Marple thanked her and departed. By midday, word had already begun to spread that a new development was underfoot. Inspector Graves had returned from much dithering and was back at the vicarage in close conversation with Reverend Hesketh. According to Mrs. Crouchrow had observed them from behind her lace curtains, the inspector was carrying a face like thunder. At the same time, Dr. Lavington had abruptly closed his surgery for the day, placing a small handwritten sign in the window out on urgent parish matters. Please leave prescriptions at the door. Miss Marple, meanwhile, paid a quiet visit to the churchyard. It was there, among the older stones, that she found Beatrice Hesketh seated on a low bench, her gloved hands folded in her lap. They say the dead don't trouble the living, Beatrice said without turning. But I find that depends very much on what the living choose to forget. Miss Marple joined her on the bench. The wind stirred the edges of their coats. Did you know about the flyer? She asked. Beatrice gave a dry smile. Of course, Alfie came to me after he had it printed. He was proud of it. I warned him not to use it. I thought he'd listened. But he did use it. Yes, and now everyone is paying the price. Miss Marple looked across the headstones, her voice soft. I believe someone else used it too. Not as a joke, as a smokescreen. Beatrice said nothing for a while, then Talbot humiliated. People, quietly, cruelly, and often, people forget that cruelty rarely leaves bruises, it leaves silence. That afternoon, Sergeant Blake knocked on the Penrose household door with Inspector Graves in tow. Jonathan Penrose met them with a calm, loyally air. But something in his expression betrayed calculation rather than concern, Miss Marple observed. From a polite distance, seemingly admiring the hedges, she watched the conversation unfold in clipped, quiet tones. Mr. Penrose gestured toward the back garden. The inspector took notes. At one point, the sergeant unrolled a small cloth bundle and retrieved a narrow-necked bottle. It was, without doubt, the one Deirdre had described later that evening. Inspector Graves gave a short, cautious statement to Reverend Hesketh and a select few parishioners. He did not name names, but he confirmed that a substance had been found and that questions were ongoing. Miss Marple returned home, her thoughts swirling. The bottle, the flyer, Alfie's lies. They formed a picture, but it wasn't finished. Yet, and then came the knock. It was Harriet Penrose. She was breathless, her coat undone, her cheeks flushed. "I had to come," she said without preamble. "Michael's gone. Left a note. Said he needed to clear his head." Miss Marple took the note and read it silently. "It said only one thing I saw. I just didn't know what to do about it." Miss Marple looked up at Harriet, her eyes steady. "Tell me everything you know," she said, her voice calm. And as Harriet began to speak, the pattern so long veiled by misdirection and fear began at last to take shape. Night had fallen over St. Irvan with a velvet softness, the village wrapped in that deep hush known only to the countryside after sundown. Yet inside Miss Marple's cottage, the quiet was anything but peaceful. Harriet Penrose sat on the edge of the armchair, still bundled in her coat despite the fire's warmth, her fingers curled tightly in her lap. Miss Marple listened without interrupting, letting the girl pour out the story she had clearly been holding back for days. It was the look on his face. Harriet said, staring into the flames, "Michael, he didn't mean to get involved. But he saw something he shouldn't have and now he doesn't know what to do with it." Miss Marple nodded gently, the flickering light playing on her thoughtful features. "What did he see?" Harriet hesitated. "He said he was walking back toward the tent when he saw Alfie crouched behind it, holding a glass, not a bottle glass, like the ones from the refreshment table. Michael didn't think much of it at the time, but later, after the major collapsed and the flyer was discovered, he remembered. Alfie wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the drinks. And he looked panicked, like he'd just done something wrong. And he told no one." Harriet shook her head. "Not at first. He thought it was all just a prank gone horribly wrong. But then the police came, and people started whispering. And then yesterday, Father came home early. He told Michael to forget what he'd seen." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened ever so slightly. "Mr. Penrose told his son to be silent." "Yes, he said it was dangerous to get involved in something you couldn't control, that it was a time for silence, not sentiment." Michael was shaken. "He doesn't trust Father anymore." Miss Marple leaned back, her thoughts clicking into alignment. She had been waiting, piecing the facts together slowly and cautiously, as was her way. But now the pattern has emerged. The moment had come. She stood and moved toward her writing desk, retrieving a small, unopened envelope. She had received it earlier that day from Inspector Graves, who had agreed, albeit reluctantly, to allow her a degree of discretion in the final stretch of the investigation. It contained a simple document, a copy of the toxicology report. As Miss Marple broke the seal and unfolded the paper, she scanned the contents quickly. Her eyes, though aging, missed nothing. The poison had been identified digitalis, extracted from foxglove, a common enough plant, but fatal in high doses, administered in a liquid medium, almost certainly introduced in a drink. And the port had tested clean, so then it wasn't the port after all. "Harriet," Miss Marple said softly, "do you recall who poured the Major's glass of sherry?" Harriet frowned. "I think Mrs. Crouch did, or said she did. Why?" But Miss Marple was already rising from her seat. She moved with quiet purpose, crossing to her cupboard where she retrieved a tin of biscuits and a length of twine. Her movements were brisk, but there was something ritualistic about them. She turned back to Harriet. "My dear, I'm going to ask you to do something rather peculiar. Tomorrow afternoon, I'd like you to invite Alfie Penrose here for tea. Tell him it's a quiet chat, just the three of us. You'll say I have a proposal for the village newsletter. Something he might design." Harriet blinked. "But why? What will that accomplish?" Miss Marple's expression was calm. "Because I need to see how he reacts when faced with a very particular sort of pressure. And when someone is guilty, it's never the accusation that gives them away, it's the silence that follows it. The next afternoon, under a crisp and cloudless sky, Alfie Penrose arrived at Miss Marple's door. He was dressed in a smart jacket, trying hard to look older than his 17 years, but his eyes gave him away. There was nervous energy about him, hands shoved too far into his pockets, shoulders tight, smile a little too eager. Harriet greeted him and led him into the parlour, where Miss Marple waited with a tray of tea and a plate of shortbread arranged with military precision. "Thank you for coming, Alfie." Miss Marple said warmly, "I do so appreciate young people who contribute to their communities." He offered a tense smile. Harriet said something about a newsletter. Yes, she replied breezily, pouring his tea. "But that can wait. I do hate to rush conversation before the second cup. No, I was hoping you could help with something else entirely." Something of a family curiosity. He glanced at her warily. "Oh, yes, you see, I came across a rather old typewriter recently. A friend gave it to me after her uncle passed, lovely little thing, and I found, to my surprise, it produces a very particular typeface." She reached into the side drawer and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, without a word. She passed it to Alfie. He opened it. His face paled. It was a perfect replica of the flyer. He swallowed. "It's the same one." "Yes, I thought so too," Miss Marple said lightly. "Fascinating how certain typewriters leave behind their own signatures, like fingerprints. And wouldn't you know, the printer in Dunbridge remembers a very polite young man who placed an order in person, paid in cash, described it as a joke." Alfie shifted in his chair. "It wasn't meant to hurt anyone, no," she said gently, "but someone else used it to do just that." There was a pause. Alfie's eyes darted toward the door. Harriet looked at him, torn between fear and something like pity. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you give anyone a drink that afternoon, Alfie?" "No, I didn't touch anything." "Are you sure?" "I said I didn't." His voice rose. His cup rattled in the saucer. Miss Marple folded her hands. "I believe you. But there's something you must understand. Your prank created the opportunity, and someone stepped through it with both feet." He slumped in the chair. "I didn't know. I didn't know he'd actually die." "Who?" "I don't know," Alfie said, shaking his head. "But someone else had to know about it, about the flyer, about when it would appear." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And who did you tell?" There was a pause. Then, quietly, "I told my father, outside." The wind had picked up again. The branches of the elm tree scraped gently against the window pane. "Alfie," Miss Marple said softly, "sometimes fathers protect their sons, and sometimes sons protect their fathers, but neither should protect a lie." He looked up, tears in his eyes now. "You think he did it?" Miss Marple didn't answer. She stood, crossed to the bureau, and retrieved another envelope, this one addressed and sealed. "It's time we stop guessing," she said. "I shall deliver this to Inspector Graves, and tomorrow morning we shall know. There is one final piece to this puzzle, and it lies not in what was done, but in who stood to lose everything if it were revealed." She turned back to Alfie and Harriet. "You've both been very brave. Now, let's have some more tea, shall we?" The conversation shifted, but the undercurrent remained. Outside, the village of St. Irvin ticked onward, unaware that the truth was nearly ready to rise one final thread away from being pulled, and Miss Marple, the quiet watcher of all things human, had her thread in hand. Morning light broke over St. Irvin with the quiet persistence of early summer, a golden wash touching the rooftops and dewdrops alike. The postman's bicycle clicked past the vicarage just after 8, and from the bakery window came the sweet scent of warm currants and cinnamon. But there was a tension in the air that morning, one that the village itself seemed to sense, even If it couldn't name it, Miss Marple, as always, was up early. She sat at her breakfast table, her knitting untouched beside her, and a single letter open before her. It was the reply she had anticipated, the result of her late-night note to Inspector Graves, who had promised discretion and efficiency. The envelope had arrived not with pomp or ceremony, but simply slipped through the door before the sun had risen. It contained one page, neatly typed, confirming the final piece of evidence. Miss Marple folded it carefully and placed it back into her bag. She stood, donned her cardigan, and tucked a small notebook into her pocket. There would be no dramatic chase, no confession at gunpoint, no triumphant parade of clues laid out before the masses. That was not the way things were done in St. Irvyne. But the truth, like the sun, could only be hidden for so long. By 10 o'clock, Miss Marple had arrived at the vicarage, where Inspector Graves waited in the drawing-room, summoned by her earlier note. Beatrice Hesketh offered tea but declined to remain. The inspector, as usual, was cautious. "You're quite certain?" he asked, watching her with measured concern. "I am," said Miss Marple calmly. "And more importantly, so is your chemist in March." Dithering, she handed him the folded report, which he read with a slow furrow of his brow. "Digitalis, yes," he murmured, "but introduced into what?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Lemon cordial, served only to the Major, handed to him by Mrs. Crouch." The inspector frowned. She claimed she poured the port, she claimed she poured the sherry, and corrected Miss Marple, but in truth, the Major had asked for lemon cordial earlier in the afternoon due to the heat. "I spoke to Mrs. Yates, who helped in the kitchen. She remembered it well, because the cordial had to be fetched from the pantry. She also remembered Mrs. Crouch took the tray out herself, saying she wanted to make sure it reached the right hands. And the poison, foxglove," Miss Marple replied. "Common enough in many gardens, including her own. It wouldn't take much, just a few leaves steeped overnight in hot water, added to the cordial before the party." The inspector let out a slow breath. But why would she kill him? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened her notebook and read aloud a line copied from the letters Miss Brinton had handed to Mr. Linley. "She knows about the girl, the one from Dunbridge, told me she's threatening to speak. Talbot," Miss Marple said, "had a history with women that was unpleasant, not just in his youth. The girl mentioned in that letter she was never identified, but I think Mrs. Crouch knew exactly who she was." The inspector looked up. "You think it was her daughter?" "No, her sister," Miss Marple said. "Lucy, a maid in Dunbridge 25 years ago. She disappeared after working in Talbot's household for a season. People said she'd run off with a soldier. But I spoke to Mrs. Ford, who used to serve at the rectory. She remembered Mrs. Crouch's family well. Said Lucy came back one winter, pale and quiet, then vanished entirely. They never spoke of her again. Talbot ruined her." Miss Marple nodded. "And Mrs. Crouch never forgot it." Graves sat back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. "So she saw the flyer, realized Talbot would be at the party, and used the boy's prank as cover." "She didn't just see the flyer," Miss Marple replied. "She helped place it. That's the only way she could be sure of timing. She convinced Alfie it would be harmless fun, letting him think it was all his idea." The inspector stared at her. "You're saying this whole thing, this performance, was a manipulation?" "It was," Miss Marple said quietly, "but not by a professional criminal, by a grieving sister, one who waited decades for a moment she believed would never come." Graves stood, his expression unreadable. "We'll need a statement, and a search of her property." Miss Marple nodded. "But I'd like to speak to her first," she added, "if you wouldn't mind." She found Mrs. Crouch in the garden behind her house, tending to her geraniums with a calmness that belied the storm approaching. When she saw Miss Marple, she straightened slowly. Dusting her hands on her apron, "Miss Marple," she said, without surprise. "Come to talk about flowers, in a way," Miss Marple said gently. "I came to speak about foxglove." Mrs. Crouch's hands froze. "I'm afraid," Miss Marple continued, "that Inspector Graves will soon be here with questions about the cordial and about what happened to your sister." There was a long pause. The wind picked up, rustling the trees above them. "He never remembered her," Mrs. Crouch said, staring at the soil. "Not once. Not when I passed him in the lane. Not when he visited the tea room. But I remembered, every day." "I believe you," Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Crouch looked at her, eyes full of calm sorrow. "He thought he was untouchable. Untouchable men leave wreckage behind them, but eventually they reach the end of the line." "The flyer," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Crouch gave the faintest smile. "Death never runs late." Within the hour, she had been taken into quiet custody. There was no scene, no outburst. She handed over a small vial from her kitchen cabinet without protest. She even apologized for misleading young Alfie. When word spread through the village, it was met not with outrage, but with silence. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her garden, sipping her tea and listening to the first call of a nightingale in the hedgerow. She thought of Mrs. Crouch, now sitting in a holding cell, and of Lucy, a name spoken only in whispers, of Michael Penrose, who had told the truth at last, of Deirdre, who had chosen conscience over fear, and of Harold Talbot, whose death had seemed like theatre but was, in truth, a reckoning. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. There would be talk in the morning. There always was, but for now the village was still. And Miss Marple, once more, had uncovered the truth not through fingerprints or forensics, but through the quiet rhythms of human behaviour. She had listened, as always, to what people said, and more importantly, to what they didn't. It was a Sunday unlike any other that summer in St. Irvan. The bell at St. Mary's Church rang out its usual peals, steady and clear, yet the sound seemed to carry a different weight. The villagers, accustomed to their routines and rituals, moved through the morning with quiet deliberation, their faces drawn a little tighter, their eyes holding the sort of knowledge that could not be unlearned. The garden party now belonged to memory already softened at the edges by gossip and retelling, but with a core that remained fixed and untouchable. Major Talbot was dead, Mrs. Crouch was gone, and the flyer, with its chillingly clever turn of phrase, had become the symbol of something far larger than a village prank. At the vicarage, Reverend Hesketh delivered a sermon marked by sombre reflection. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke of judgment, mercy, and the burdens people carry in silence. Beatrice sat beside him in the front pew, her posture ramrod straight, her eyes unreadable. She had not spoken publicly since the arrest, and though many wondered what she knew or suspected, no one dared ask. The Penroses kept to themselves. Harriet sat beside her brother Michael, both of them unusually subdued. Their father, Mr. Penrose, had made himself conspicuously absent, whether from shame, fear, or simple convenience. He had departed for London the day after the arrest, citing business. No one had seen him since. Deirdre Fenn attended quietly, slipping into a back pew and folding her hands in her lap. She did not look at anyone. She stared straight ahead, lips moving silently during the hymns. Though Miss Brinton had returned to work at the post office, she remained pale and easily startled, her usual crisp manner softened now by something more vulnerable. Miss Marple, dressed in her best grey coat and straw hat, took her usual place near the front, neither intrusive nor inconspicuous. She listened intently to the sermon, but her eyes wandered, as they always did, catching small details others overlooked. She noticed the tear in Mrs. Webb's gloves, the way young Alfie Penrose avoided looking toward the altar. The flicker of sorrow across Miss Brinton's face when the congregation sang Abide with Me. These were not clues, not anymore. The mystery had been solved. The pieces had been laid out and understood, but even solved mysteries left traces behind marks on the fabric of daily life. After the service, the villagers gathered outside the church, as was tradition. The sunlight warmed the cobbles, and the birds flitted from eaves to steeple, but the usual chatter was muted. Such a sad business, murmured Mrs. Webb to Mrs. Ford. I never would have guessed, said the latter. Shaking her head, Mrs. Crouch always seemed so. Pride hides a great deal, said Miss Brinton quietly as she passed them, especially when grief has nowhere to go. Miss Marple stood near the light gate, speaking with Reverend Hesketh, who looked older somehow, as though the weight of the past fortnight had settled into his shoulders. I fear we've been reminded. He said that even among gardens and tea parties, we're never very far from sorrow. Miss Marple nodded, her hands gently folded over her handbag. Sorrow often takes root where silence is allowed to grow, she replied. But it can also be where understanding begins. He glanced at her with a small, weary smile. You've done us a great service, Miss Marple, though I imagine it has cost something. Oh, not at all, she said lightly. A little time, a little knitting. Gone unfinished, but better that than letting a good many misunderstandings become permanent. The Reverend sighed. Do you think she'll be treated fairly? I think the law will see what she did and weigh it carefully, Miss Marple said. But I also believe the law does not always see what came before. That's left to the rest of us. They parted with polite words, but her thoughts stayed with Mrs. Crouch. She had received word from Inspector Graves just that morning quietly, in confidence that Mrs. Crouch had confessed in full. Her sister had died just 2 years after returning from Dunbridge. There had been no investigation, no justice, only a family name that became a whispered embarrassment. And a wound that never healed. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward her cottage. Along the way, she passed the green where the garden party had been held. The tables were long gone. Only a few flattened patches of grass hinted at where the guests had once mingled. A child's shoe lay forgotten beneath a hedge, and the vicariage's bunting, now tattered and half removed, fluttered weakly in the wind. She paused at the war memorial. The names etched in stone stood quiet and eternal. Among them, as always, was Frederick Talbot Harold's older brother, a hero in the war, a man of good standing. Remembered with affection, Harold's name would never be added to the memorial. Of course, his legacy would be whispered in back rooms and carried only by rumour. In some ways, it was exactly what he had feared, and what he had earned. She moved on, passing by the grocer's and giving a soft nod to Mr. Reeves, who raised a hand but said nothing. Even he, normally a font of speculation, seemed reluctant to keep the gossip alive. At her cottage, Miss Marple set the kettle to boil, then stepped outside to tend to her roses. The blooms were coming in nicely this year, deep reds, pale creams. A lovely peach one from a cutting she'd brought back from Devon. She snipped a few heads, clearing space for new growth, her movements practiced and patient. As the water began to boil inside, she allowed herself one final glance toward the green. There would be more garden parties. In time, more cakes and string quartets and village chatter. St. Irvan would return to its habits because that was the way of English villages, but some things would never be quite the same. There would be a new note of caution beneath the cheer, a shadow beneath the bunting. People would remember, even if they pretended not to, and Miss Marple, ever watchful, would sit with her knitting and her tea, listening not just to what was said, but to the spaces in between. For in those spaces, the silences, the pauses, the slight hesitations, lay the truths others missed, the truths that solved murders, yes, but also revealed the quiet burdens people carried through ordinary days. She picked up her cup. Now steeped, just right, and settled into her armchair by the window. Outside, the village moved on. Inside, Miss Marple watched, listened, and understood, as always.